Hi, welcome. My name is Helen and I've been attending and serving at Brave with my family for the past 7 years. I'm here to share how to receive communion. Have you ever wondered why, when we're in church or at a Brave group, we eat a tiny bit of bread and drink a little bit of juice or wine, and what it really means for each of us? To answer this question, we look to the very first communion. Before Jesus went to the cross, he had one last meal with his disciples. While they all sat around the table, and as they were eating, Jesus took some bread, broke it, gave it to them and said, "This is my body, which is given for you." The bread represents his body, which was broken on the cross on which he died. He instructed his disciples to do this in remembrance of me. Every time we take communion, we are choosing to remember what Jesus did on the cross. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them and said, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the many for the forgiveness of sins." The wine represented his blood, the sacrifice he made for me and for each of us. What's really interesting about communion is that it wasn't the first time Jesus used bread and wine as important symbols of our walk with him. Jesus himself said, "I am the bread of life." Bread represents food. Without it, our physical bodies would starve. In the same way, without Jesus, there would be spiritual hunger and starvation. When we eat the physical bread, we remind ourselves of our spiritual need for him. In the book of John, we read of Jesus' first miracle, the turning of water into wine. Jesus said to the servants at the wedding, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." Immediately after this, John tells us what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It is no coincidence that in the miracle of Jesus' death, where his blood was shed for us, that the wine represents his glory and we believe in him. One last thing before we move on. Before Jesus became the perfect sacrifice on the cross, the Jewish community would offer up animal sacrifices. That sounds crazy in our modern world, yet God took the cost of our sin, our mistakes, our wrongdoing seriously. Because God is perfect and without sin, he required a perfect sacrifice to create that bridge to us. That was Jesus. The cup of wine he passed around represents that. So we take communion together to remember. It's a time to stop, be still, and reflect on who God is. So how can we take communion at home? For my family, we do it together at a meal. We take a loaf of bread or a small dinner roll, or sometimes some water crackers if we've run low on bread. And at the end of dinner, one of us will read the passage from the Bible, usually from Matthew or Luke, to remind ourselves of why we're doing it and to teach our children. We'll say, "And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it. Gave it to them and said, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' I break the bread and hold it out to one of my daughters or husband and say, 'This is my body, broken for you.' They each take a small piece of bread and repeat the blessing to the next person. Then we'll take a cup of juice and say, 'This cup is the covenant, the promise in my blood, which is poured out for you.' I take the cup, take a sip, and again turn to whoever is next to me and say, 'This is my blood shed for you.' And the cup passes around the table. At the end, sometimes we'll pray as a family, each taking a moment to say something we're thankful for. Other time, the moment passes quickly and everyone is back on with their homework or the events of the day. But what is important is that we have taken a moment to remember what God has done for us through his Son, Jesus. It is a moment to pause life, to examine ourselves, and to meet with God. Take a moment this week to share communion with your family, or join us here at Brave on Friday the 5th of February, anytime between 5 to 7 p.m. for a drive-up communion. There will be designated parking and someone will serve you with a pre-packaged communion packet. And if you'd like to receive prayer as well, members of the Team Brave will be available. So in the words of Jesus, do this in remembrance of him. Thanks for joining me.